What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'm going to give you my top 5 tips for brewing your best Belgian-style beers. Now, when I say Belgian-style beers, I mean broadly Trappist-style ales, Abbey ales, Saisons, Golden Strong ales, that sort of type of beer, including wit beer as well, not Belgian-style sour beers. That'll be a separate thing entirely. But this is generally for that subset of beers that the broad public will refer to as a Belgian beer. These are truly some of my favorite kinds of beer overall. They're incredibly complex in flavor and in drinking quality, and they really are actually the beer style that kind of brought me into craft beer and then eventually brewing as a result. So they have a special place in my heart, and having family that lives in Belgium, I've had a great chance to experience some of the best they have to offer, and really dive deep into their brewing culture and their brewing traditions. I've been to Belgium and explored much of their brewing culture and actually had a chance to speak to a Trappist monk in Chimay itself, which was really cool. Definitely one of my top 10 beer and brewing experiences. Later this year, in fact, I'll be going back to Belgium for the 3rd time, which is just an amazing thing to be able to say. And I'm very grateful for having that opportunity to do that. If you're curious about the travel experience there, I do have a video that covered my travel in Belgium, so please check that out when you got some time. But for today, we're gonna focus on how to brew that style of beer. The first, and I would argue the single most important thing, keep the recipe simple. Now, these are incredibly complex beers in terms of flavor and the overall drinking experience. They bring a ton to the table, and it's a very difficult thing to wrap your mind around, especially if you're a novice homebrewer, that these are not complicated beers when it comes to the recipe. Most Belgian beers have evolved from monastic brewing, which refers to beers that were brewed in monasteries by monks. Brewing traditions in the monasteries really grew to raise money for their order and their abbeys, and also to provide weary travelers along the road with a place to rest and a place to drink. And this is a tradition that still continues somewhat to this day. The Trappist monasteries that are still brewing today, to include Chimay, even though its worldwide popularity is so high, still invest all of their profits in donating to those in need and also just sustaining their operations, just sustaining their abbey. They are not at all a for-profit organization. The monks themselves have committed to a life of simplicity and frugality. There's no reason to believe that the beer that the monks brew, therefore, would be complex and expensive and rely on specialty ingredients. No, it always seems to be a very simple base recipe. I do encourage you to read Brew Like a Monk by Stan Hieronymus for some extra context on this. It's a great read and really helps you understand the philosophy of brewing these Belgian beers. Most of the time, whether it's a pale, amber, or dark beer, the base is going to be a good chunk of Belgian Pilsner malt or Belgian Pale Ale malt, and then maybe 1, maybe 2 specialty malts, like aromatic malt is a very common one, sometimes Special B. And then generally that's it. The final ingredient that really brings these beers a lot of character is Belgian candy sugar. Belgian candy sugar not only varies widely in terms of color, going from a colorless to a very dark version, but also in terms of flavor and intensity. At the light end of the spectrum, they're not really going to add too much flavor, especially the perfectly clear version. You're not going to get any added flavor whatsoever from that, which makes it great for like Belgian golden ales. But then when you start moving through the color spectrum, it starts to have similar results to adding like a crystal malt, for example. You're gonna get like raisin characteristics, not really caramel, but maybe some honey. And as it gets darker beyond that, you're gonna start bringing in dark fruits, molasses, and that quintessential dark Belgian character that you get out of dark, strong ales, for example. Those flavors are really derived pretty significantly from the sugars. The other thing that candy sugar does is that it provides a large and easily digestible source of fermentable sugars to the yeast. This is going to do 2 things. Number 1, it's going to dry the beer out significantly, which is pretty characteristic of the style. The drier it is, generally the easier it is to drink. And these are world-renowned for drinking like a 4 or 5% beer, but somehow being 9 to 10% alcohol. But sugar is a big part of that, right? But also the sugar gives you this intense kick of yeast flavor. Generally, when the yeast encounter very simple sugars like the ones in Belgian candy syrups, they go ballistic. And that really provides a lot of that yeast expression that these beers are known for. And more on that later. And also, when you're making these beers, I really do recommend getting a Belgian maltster, getting the right kind of Belgian yeast, using continental European hops like Saaz, Hallertau, Tettnang, that sort of thing. These are really critical aspects to making a really authentic tasting Belgian style beer. And that is technically true with the candy sugar as well, but there's a lot of evidence out there that points to the contrary, in that you really can get away with things like brown sugar or table sugar, especially if you're adding them during the boil. The heat of the boil breaks down the complex sucrose style sugar into fructose and glucose, which makes it a lot easier for the yeast, and that actually is going to get you a very similar result to adding something like candy syrup into the fermenter. You can find just that people are making award-winning Belgian-style ales with basic things like brown sugar and molasses and table sugar. So don't feel like the candy syrup is an absolute must. I like it for the sake of authenticity, but it's really not a complete requirement. So for tip number 2, it is to stay away from the spices. This is something that's a little bit controversial sometimes for some reason, but I can tell you with a very, very high degree of confidence that Belgian brewers do not use spices in their beers. They are getting all of that character from their yeast and learning how to work with that yeast and to coax out the best they can from the fermentation. And again, more on that later. Now there's one, maybe two particular styles of beer where that's not the case, and we'll talk about that in a sec here, but for everything else, it's all basically just malt, hops, yeast, and water. Belgian yeasts have a lot of different strains within them that do a lot of different things in the fermentation at different temperatures, at different pitch rates, with different ingredients behind them. That all works together to get you this really intense and exciting, spicy, fruity, herbal kind of weird combination of flavors and aromas that comes across to us like opening a spice drawer. And there's really, it's a very difficult thing to describe other than just Belgian character. But many people will try to replicate that with things like coriander and orange peel and, you know, various other spices. And sometimes that works out very, very well, but it's usually very difficult for the yeast and the other ingredients to compete with the extra spices that are added in sometimes to these beers. And oftentimes that throws the balance off. Now, don't misinterpret what I'm saying as, don't ever use spices, it's a terrible thing, shame on you. That's not what I'm saying here. If you want to use spices in your beer, go for it. You're the brewer. Like, be an adult, do what you want to do. It's what homebrewing is all about. But if you want to brew a truly authentic and, you know, traditionally inspired Belgian style beer, spices are not an ingredient you should be using. That being said, all of that gets thrown out the window for talking about wit beer and sometimes saison. These two styles of Belgian beer can have spices in them every so often, and it adds a nice added element to it. The reason for that is they are fundamentally different beers than Abbey-style or Trappist-style beers. Wit beer traditionally is going to have orange peel and coriander in it, sometimes chamomile and cardamom. Saison sometimes has the same ingredients, or actually I've seen a lot of peppercorns go into saisons now, and it actually is a really, really nice flavor. What I recommend doing in that case is, instead of focusing 100% on the spice itself being like the centerpiece, I recommend using the spices to just subtly emphasize particular characteristics of the yeast. For example, like the coriander and the peppercorns kind of emphasize more of the phenolic character of the yeast, with its spiciness. Whereas things like orange peel, for example, will emphasize more of the ester side, where the fruity characteristics come out. But the point I'm trying to make here is, the yeast expression should be the #1 tool in your arsenal to get those flavors first. And if you're not able to reliably get the level of fruitiness or spiciness that you want out of your yeast, then maybe consider rebrewing it and adding a few of those spices. But when you're doing that, please, for the love of God, use a very light hand. The spices go such a long way in brewing, and it's kind of crazy how little it takes for a full 5-gallon batch of beer to be overpowered by a simple spice addition. So just be careful with that, even if you're brewing something that does traditionally have spices in it. But if you're not brewing something that has traditionally spices in it, then I do recommend staying away from them. All right, tip number 3 is all about the fermentation, and this is so important, guys. The fermentation character is the centerpiece, the cornerstone of these beers. All of the character that these beers are known for comes from the yeast and the fermentation. Now, there's a lot of different ways you can approach getting a lot of character out of these yeasts. You can try underpitching them. You can try pushing them really hard into the high end of their temperature spectrum. You can try feeding them tons and tons of sugars. You can also try adding sugars during the fermentation to really coax out more of that flavor as it goes through the fermentation. Now, I have tried pretty much all of those techniques, and what I have settled on as the most reliable way to get really high quality Belgian character out of my yeast is this. First and foremost, I'm gonna pitch a healthy amount of active yeast. This is standard practice for brewing any beer, but like I said, sometimes people will try to underpitch the Belgian beers to get a little bit more character out of the yeast, and I've done that in the past, and I can't tell you it really works all that well. It's kind of a risky approach because you're just as likely to get fusel alcohols and terrible character out of the yeast as you are to get increased esters and phenols. So I do recommend starting with a good, healthy pitch appropriate to the gravity of the beer that you're brewing, and then pitch that nice and cold. Usually about 65 degrees is where I like to pitch my Belgian ales. This is gonna start the yeast off in a healthy way and prevent that fusel alcohol generation as well. And then, as soon as you've got the yeast pitched, turn off the fermentation control. I'd really recommend for pretty much all Belgian yeast not letting the temperature fall below like 68 degrees or about 20 Celsius, but not really giving it any sort of upper limit. Belgian yeasts will ferment very aggressively and will really just like go after it during that primary fermentation. They generate a lot of heat, and in so doing, they kind of self-heat and then self-excite, and it's a little bit of a runaway cycle. Sometimes, depending on your pitch rate and your ambient temperatures, you can get up to like 82, 85 degrees in the fermenter just from a standard fermentation. If you have to limit that because of your ambient surroundings, I would recommend keeping the fermentation between 68 degrees and 82 to 85 degrees, depending on the yeast strain you're using. For those of you who use Celsius, 82 Fahrenheit's around like 27, 28 degrees Celsius. Once it peaks at that temperature, it peaks at that activity level, it's gonna start falling back down to whatever your baseline is. In that phase, it's gonna clean up a lot of the kind of excessive dirty character that it might have generated during the beginning, but it's gonna keep all of those esters and phenols that you're after. All of that quintessential Belgian yeast character is gonna stick around. It's gonna clean up things like diacetyl and acetaldehyde during this phase, and that's very important. So once that phase is complete, then you can start that maturation and conditioning time, depending on the style of beer that you're making. The other aspect of the yeast to consider here is the strain. For like classic Belgian ales, you can generally separate them out into a few different categories. You've got Trappist-style yeasts, you've got non-Trappist-style yeasts, and you've got Saison yeasts, and these are all slightly different. And then of course there's wit beer, which is its own thing. For Trappist-style yeast, we're talking about, you know, yeast that's been sourced from a Trappist brewery that's known to us today. Places like Westmalle, or Chimay, or Rochefort. Sorry if I'm pronouncing these wrong, I probably am, but you get the picture. These yeasts are generally going to be very high on the like esters. You're gonna get lots of rich like pear and apple esters and banana character from them. There's certainly a decidedly present element of phenols as well. You're getting that peppery spiciness and clove and coriander that these beers are really known for. In my experience, Trappist ale yeasts have typically been the most expressive out of all of the Belgian yeasts in general. They're gonna perform very, very well at a wide range of temperatures, and they're going to leave you with a really, really nice beer at the end of the process. They're very tolerant in general, although if you mistreat them at the beginning of the fermentation, they will bite you back, so just be careful about that. For non-Trappist yeasts, I'm talking about basically like golden strong ale yeasts or the Ardennes strain, for example. That would be the Duvel strain and the Achouffe strain, respectively. There's a few other strains that fall into this category, but the general consensus for these yeast strains is that you're generally going to see a little bit less overall kind of fermentation character in them than the Trappist strains. They're a little cleaner, if that makes sense. We're talking about Belgians here, so it's not really clean at all, but they're gonna give you less ester, a little bit more phenol, a little bit more balanced of a character for a beer that's ultimately still complex and still, you know, enjoyable to drink, but not nearly as much of a flavor bomb as a Trappist ale. Lastly, there's Saison strains, and these are very different in their behavior, but still very similar in many of their flavors to the other ones I mentioned earlier. Belgian Saison strains typically are going to be diastatic as positive. What that means is that they have a gene in their makeup that basically allows them to break down really long, complex molecules of sugar that other yeast would not be able to ferment. It breaks them down into smaller short-chain sugars, which then are easily fermentable by the yeast. So over time, what this is going to do is it's going to create a very, very dry beer. Saisons are typically dry for a reason. It's because of the diastaticus. While Trappist-style ales and other Belgian ales are pretty commonly dry beers, dry finishing beers, they're not Saison dry because their yeasts are not always diastaticus positive. Saison strains are still going to give you that really nice peppery character. They're sometimes going to give you like a little bit of a lemon peel note, and then you just get this really nice, intense dryness and spiciness out of them that I really enjoy personally. But it's a totally different kind of yeast strain, and if you're using it, a bit of a word of caution, especially if you're bottle conditioning. Ensure that you've hit your real final gravity before you put them into bottles. If your beer is sitting at 1010, 1012, 1008 even, it may still have a lot longer to go. Typically Saisons finish around like 1.000 or somewhere in that neighborhood, right? So just be careful about that. You don't want to continue the fermentation in the bottles too far and have them encounter an overpressure condition where they explode. That's very dangerous. So just something to keep in mind. The point I'm trying to make here, though, is depending on what kind of beer character you are after, the choice of yeast strain is incredibly important in them, as they all have very different qualities. This is true for pretty much every style of beer, but especially so for Belgians because you're kind of pulling several different levers all at the same time to get a very specific end result, and the yeast, and also how you treat the yeast and ferment it, is a huge lever. I had to pour myself a real Belgian ale here for tip number 4. This is a Westvleteren 8, a classic Trappist dark ale. One of the most important aspects of a really high quality Belgian ale is its visual appearance, in that the head has this texture to it and has strong head retention, high carbonation, and lasts for a very, very long time. A good quality classic style Belgian ale has a couple things going for it. Not only does it have that head retention and construction that I mentioned earlier, but secondly, it's very highly attenuated and it still finishes dry, but has a lot of residual flavor and has a very complex, sugary kind of finish to it, while still being very dry. How exactly does that happen all at the same time? You think when you have a very dry beer, you're not gonna have a lot of sugar flavor left over. And also when you have a very dry beer, there's typically little left to support the head. There's a few things you can do to really make this all work out. Firstly, I would highly recommend, if you have the ability to do it, I would do a step mash. When you do a step mash, you're able to really just take advantage of the best of both worlds. Doing a step mash allows you to independently control the beta amylase enzyme, which is responsible for creating short chain sugars that increases the fermentability of the wort and also increases the attenuation of the beer. And also the alpha amylase enzyme independently from that, which is responsible for creating longer chain sugars, which are not only more flavorful, but also increase the body and the mouthfeel of the beer. They are also responsible for keeping the head on the beer as well, and generating something for that CO2 to lift up and bubble out of the beer in this way. What I've settled on for my personal mash schedule for a Belgian ale most of the time is going to be a 45-minute rest at about 148 degrees Fahrenheit. And then I follow that up with a 30-minute rest at 158 degrees Fahrenheit. The nice thing about step mashing is, while it will take a little bit longer to fully convert everything, you're left with the ability to kind of independently work those two variables to get the final result that you want. And it's subtle, but it does actually work. Even after 45 minutes at 148 degrees, there still is a little something left over in there for the alpha amylase to work on and creating these nice longer chain sugars. And at the end of the day, what you are left with is this result, where you have a nice, highly attenuated beer that still has loads of flavor, complexity, and a good head retention. The other thing you can do is you can add a little bit of wheat malt into the grist to give you a little bit of that protein to help support a good fluffy head. And that's something that I definitely would recommend as well. It's more of like an insurance prophylactic type thing, but it does help a lot. The final tip that I have for you on these beers is let them sit in condition. Like, it's so crazy how much the flavor on these things change and evolve over time, especially if they're stronger. Most Belgian ales are north of 5% alcohol, so it does, really help you to condition them a little bit and let that flavor not only stabilize, but also just evolve into something a little bit more refined over time. Traditionally, these are done in bottles. Belgian ales are usually bottle conditioned for the purposes of having high carbonation. That's why you got corks and champagne style bottles typically. But the bottle conditioning also allows for them to evolve their flavor profile over time. It also allows you to kind of separate out your batch and, drink it a little bit early, drink it a little bit in the middle, drink it at the end of a long aging period, and see how it's changed. It's a good technique and something I do recommend doing, but this is also totally possible in a keg. So don't get me wrong, you can still bulk condition your Belgian ales in a keg. It'll go a little bit faster, actually, if you do it that way. But for things like Belgian triple, Belgian quad stuff, it's like 8% or higher. I really do recommend letting it sit a couple months if you can, because that flavor profile is gonna be wildly different. This Westblätter in 8 was brought over by my in-laws from the last time they visited us. It's about 6 months old now, and it's really hitting a nice stride. And this is an 8% alcohol beer, but when it comes to things like Westblätter in 12, which is a classic example of a Belgian quad or Belgian dark strong ale, that sort of thing can age really beautifully up for like 2 to 4 years even sometimes, and just this really, really nice character that develops in them, a slight oxidative note that enhances the dark fruit characteristics of the beer. It's something that I do recommend doing. If you're trying to enter these into a competition, definitely age them, because that is a critical aspect of it, just having that really smooth, gentle, but very complex and nuanced aged flavor. It's very important for certain styles of Belgian beer. The lighter colored ones like triples are not going to necessarily need that much aging time, and it's more beneficial to drink them younger a little bit, but regardless, a few weeks to a few months is not gonna hurt them, and generally might be something to look into. Now, so those are my 5 tips on how to make your best Belgian ales, but there's a lot more than 5 things you can do to make your best. And if you're an avid brewer of Belgian ales, please let me know in the comments section what your favorite tips, techniques, and procedures are to make your best versions. Because there's just so much out there. There's so many different things you can do. And ultimately, what I encourage you to do if you're new to this is just try it out, brew a few, experiment around, see what kind of yeasts you like to use, see what flavor profiles you're after, drink a ton of Belgian beer, get some ideas. It is a very creative beer style that allows for a lot of things to be tweaked in it, and it's one of the more interesting ones to play around with, and I think it's definitely one of the most flavorful ones you can get. I'm kind of waxing poetic a little bit here, but I love these beers. I am so passionate about making them, and it's like I said, it's hard to really boil it down to 5 things alone. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you're new to brewing these things, don't hesitate to reach out and ask questions. I will help you as best I can, or someone else will get to you before I get to you. But either way, please engage, and I'm here to help you. Before you click away, also please don't forget to like the video. It does really actually help me out a lot. That's not just something that we all say, there's a reason for it. And also please subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like this and grain to glass videos where I brew stuff like this. I have another Belgian planned for this year, and I'm hoping I can get it done soon. So keep your eyes peeled for that one. If you want to support the channel, please consider picking up a t-shirt like this one. You can get this design and plenty of others in the merchandise store, which is linked down in the description box below. I also have a Patreon, and my patrons are truly the biggest financial help for this channel, without a doubt. You guys have helped me fund my production quality and fund really interesting and exciting brewing upgrades that ultimately bring higher quality content to the channel. Everything that you guys give me gets reinvested in some way, shape, or form into what I do here. So I really do appreciate everything you're doing. I also have channel memberships, and there's the super thanks button as other quick and easy ways to help support me. Again, that all gets reinvested back into the channel, and that means a lot to me. I have an Amazon store in the description box as well, where you can find all of the channel's production equipment, as well as a lot of the brewing equipment and stuff. It's available on Amazon that I've used and personally vouched for. So please check that out if you're curious about some of that stuff. It's no additional cost to you, but it does help me out a little bit as well. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook at The Apartment Brewer. So check that stuff out for some more frequent content and just to see what's going to be coming to the channel in the near or distant future. And last but certainly not least, if you're still here, thank you very much for watching all the way to the end of the video. I put a lot of work into these things, and it means a lot to me if you're still watching, because that tells me that it's worth it for you. And so therefore this one goes out to you. I'm not gonna chug this because it's a very special beer, but regardless, this one's for you guys. Till the next one, cheers.